I'm Barrie Shepley. It's been a life of endurance sport, coaching, administration, commentating for me, and still in the middle of the next generation of athletes coming through. So although it's been 5 Olympic Games already, 25 Ironmans, and probably 40 World Championships, it still feels like I'm fresh and young and feeling as motivated as I was 3 decades ago. Life's a lot about timing, and for me, I just happened to have been a 16-year-old coming through just when triathlon was hitting those first early days of Ironman. And the United States, obviously, and Hawaii played a huge impact on the worldwide sport. And I was very, very, very fortunate that a Canadian, Les McDonald, who became the ITU International President, the first president for 2 decades, the man that got us into the Olympic Games, happened to become a mentor for me when I was still just in my teens. And so I got to see the sport when there were no rules, there were no federations, there were no coaches, just a couple of race directors putting on some events, different distances, nothing really standardized, no officials. And really that was kind of the wild, wild west. And these were guys who slept in their cars and would drive off to the next location and off they would go. And with the progression of Ironman and its recognition, and then in the States, the Bud Light USTS series, there started to be these guys who were pretty good athletes who thought, maybe I could make my living at that. And simultaneously, there was a recognition that if this is going to happen, maybe there needs to be a few rules into the sport. So I happened to be lucky enough to start Triathlon Ontario, and simultaneously, because I was the president and founder in Ontario, I also got requested to sit on the Triathlon Canada board with Les McDonald. So I saw the very first days of events when we were still just trying to figure out what the distances should be. So they weren't always standard 1,500-meter swim, 40K bike, 10K run. There were variations of that. But pretty early on, Les McDonald realized that he wanted to get us into the Olympic Games, and that would make a massive difference in funding, in worldwide television, in the quality of athletes that would come into the sport. And so that in all of his meetings with Antonio Samaranch, the president of the IOC, a Spanish IOC member and the International Olympic president, the decision was it has to be television friendly. As great as Ironman is, this thing, no one's going to sit for 8 hours and watch this thing on television. So they came down to the 2-hour window. And when you put the Olympic swim of 1,500 meters that happened in the pool, and you put a time trial of 40K biking, and you put the 10,000-meter race distance, the women were coming in just under 2 hours. So that was that TV race, the men about 1 hour 45, 46, and Les's Olympic distance, sort of came in. So the early days, it was called the Olympic distance. And everything kind of started to grow out of there. So if you look at 1989 was the first ever World Championships, and that grew out of the Hawaii Ironman, because literally sitting under a tree with people from 25 or 30 different countries, predominantly Commonwealth nations of Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, Canada, obviously the United States. This was at the Hawaii Ironman. There was a decision, let's meet next year in Europe, and let's have our first ever coming together, a formation of the sport. And that's where the ITU, the International Triathlon Union, came together in 1989 in Avignon, France. Les McDonald, this Canadian, became the first ever president. And that, his driving force for the next 20 years of his life, was to get triathlon to the Olympics, more prize money, more television, etc. And a couple of things. I was now both seeing the sport from the international level, but also at the domestic level in Ontario and in Canada. And in Canada, we were really lucky that there were 4 or 5 spectacular race directors who took the sport and really took it to a whole new level. So out west, Lynn Van Dove was getting this Ironman Canada off the ground when it was just literally 5 Ironman races in the entire world. Penticton had one of those spectacular races, so the West Coast was well taken care of. There was a great race in Vancouver called the Vancouver International Triathlon right around Stanley Park, and Mark Allen won that race. So you kind of, the best in the world were coming to Canada. Meanwhile, in the east side of the country, Graham Fraser started what now is known as the Subaru series, but it had many different names over the years, from the President's Choice series, and Roy LePage was its earlier version. But that gave all these great athletes a chance to race professionally for prize money, on TSN, on CBC. And so in the mid-'80s and into the '90s, there was a significant growth curve, both of prize money, of opportunities, and Canadians were right at the forefront of that. And in the summertime, it was not unlikely to see Greg Welch, the Hawaii Ironman and world champion, to be racing in Ontario, in Milton, on that great course that people have now done thousands of times as Canadians and Ontario athletes. So I was the president of Triathlon Ontario, and one of my concerns in the first 2 years was that I saw the sport from a demographic perspective, all of these people who were 25 to 55, nobody young, zero. And if you actually take a look, most sports have 1 million young soccer players, 1 million young swimmers, 1 million young hockey, whatever the sport is, but everyone was mature in their 20s and 30s and 40s and zero kids. And I had a concern about where was the next generation going to come from. So I came up with the idea of Kids of Steel, stealing totally off the name Ironman, Kids of Steel, and found a sponsor in Toronto called Triathlon Leasing. Before the internet existed, I just went through the telephone book in Toronto, looked for sponsors, and I saw Triathlon. I got into their boardroom, and at the end of an hour and a half, I convinced the vice president that she should be sponsoring my Kids of Steel series. I spoke so eloquently and so passionately about it that she was positive this thing must be going for years. And so before she had signed a check, she wanted to see the first a Kids of Steel race. I had asked them for $100,000, which back in the '80s is a significant amount of money. So she said, you know what, before I do that, I need the other vice presidents to see one of our Kids of Steel races. It only existed in my head. Kids of Steel did not exist. There was not a series. There weren't events that existed. There were a couple backyard pool triathlons in southern Ontario and Leamington and other places. So I went to the head of summer camps at McMaster University and said, I need all 300 of your kids who are in summer camp. And this lady had requested that she needed to see a race quickly. So I said, there's a race on Friday. This was Monday. So in 4 days, we went from not existing to getting 300 kids at McMaster summer camp to do their first ever Kids of Steel triathlon. And that was the formation. She signed a check for $100,000. We rented a van, got 5,000 medals, 5,000 t-shirts. And I called every person I knew across the country to say, we're going to come to your town on this weekend. Can you get a pool, a lake, a river, and help me put on a race? So that summer we put on races in places like Whistler, in Calgary, in Montreal, in downtown Toronto. And interestingly, the one that probably has the biggest impact on Canadian sport, we happened to go to a little place called Sharbot Lake, Ontario. Most people have never heard of it. About 75 cottages there. It's about 45 minutes from Kingston. But Joan and Rudy Hollywood had a cottage there, and their son's best friend was some little scrawny kid named Simon Whitfield. And so Simon came to that very first Kids of Steel race, loved it. And as they say, the rest is history. He took up the sport by the next summer. He never gave up playing soccer, playing basketball, playing hockey. But he was awesome, loved it, and you could see the special energy that he had. And so Canada was very fortunate that we had these Graham Frasers and Lynn Van Doves creating these races. We were on television. We had the international president was a Canadian. And by the mid-'90s, we now were elected to go into the Olympic Games. So Simon went off and did his grade 11 and 12 in Sydney, Australia, at Knox Grammar School. And he called me upon graduation and said, look, the Australians are really interested in me staying here and racing for them. He had dual passport. His dad was an Aussie. His grandmother lived 2 miles away at an old age home near the Sydney Opera House Bridge. And yet he wanted to come back to Canada. So he came back to Canada, immediately one of the most competitive races we ever had against guys who were 6, 7 years older than him. Andrew McMartin, Mark Bates, Dan Murray, Paul White. These were the superstars in the '80s. And this 17-year-old kid beat them all. He, not that he didn't respect them, but he was not afraid of them. And you could tell immediately that Simon had this special kind of, energy about him. So while he was doing some magic at the short distance, the Pontus twins, Sylvia and Patricia, won dozens and dozens and dozens of the biggest races. They're absolutely identical French-Canadian ladies who were incredible athletes, and they won the Hawaii Ironman back in the '80s. And then came along the likes of Lori Bowden, Heather Feuer, Lisa Bentley, and the great Peter Reed, who won the Hawaii Ironman 3 different times and is still one of the greatest icons for Canadian sport. So here's this little tiny, tiny country that has snow, that plays hockey and curls and does other things, and this triathlon thing, what is that? But suddenly these long distance people are having phenomenal races, and then it all changed in a blink of an eye in September of 2000 when 24-year-old Simon Whitfield, who had never really won a major international race, had the race of his life, and with 300 meters to go, coming down Macquarie Street in Sydney, blows by Stefan Vukovic from Germany to have this most ridiculous live on television on a Saturday night in Canada on CBC. And it was life-changing for the entire sport, for everyone involved. Prize money continued to rise, interest, sponsorship. Little kids, our Kids of Steel races sold out the next year. You couldn't find a spot in a Kids of Steel race, all because people wanted to be like Simon. And we were lucky because sometimes when you win a big race, Olympic swimming, it's the last race of your career. You retire and it's over. Here was a kid who literally went to 3 more Olympic Games and won another silver medal, won the Commonwealth Games, won medals at Pan Ams, and dozens of World Cup races. So we were lucky to have this iconic, legendary, charismatic, people loved him guy as the role model for our sport for the next 15 years. And not too many sports are lucky enough to have that. You know, he did his first winning really early and kept on winning and winning and winning. And not just winning, but the style of how he did it. The $1 million race at High V, coming in the last 3 meters to pass everyone to win, and so forth. So we were very fortunate, and the Olympics have just continued to bring the next generation of young people through. But the sport has been spectacular on a number of levels. Right from the beginning, Les and the people involved, McDonald and others involved, wanted equality. So prize money equal for women. You don't get that in road racing. You don't get that in, bike racing. You don't get that in tennis and most other sports. But here, you had absolutely equality. And the story that Les tells me was about 4 days before the first World Championships in France. They were trying to back out of giving the women prize money. And fortunately, Les and the elite men stood up and said, well, we won't race on Sunday if you don't give the women equal prize money. And so the next day, Aaron Baker got the same prize purse that Mark Allen got to win the men's race. And I think that's critical. It's something I'm very proud of, that I could have a daughter, a niece, that my female athletes are treated with equality, same distance, same respect, same television time, same magazine time. And in some cases, Daniela Reef, has been making more money than any of the men in the last couple of years because of the prize money bonuses that she's been able to win. So it's been awesome to see. And then the last 2 components, the age group racing, this phenomenal, I'll see athletes at the Gold Coast in a few weeks that are 85 and over, doing the triathlon. How spectacular is that? So these 5-year age categories have given everybody a desire to have a new birthday and get the hell out of that age category and up to the 60 from the 55 or whatever may be the case. And then the last thing, which has really exploded in the last 24, 36 months, is the para racing. And it's something that ITU has been very proud of right from the beginning. So we have athletes who are blind, we have athletes missing limbs, we have athletes that are, in a wheelchair, et cetera. And so it's been inspiring to watch how this has grown. So this has really grown from this crazy little Ironman thing. Literally, this will be the 40th anniversary when I'm in Hawaii in October of the first ever Hawaii Ironman. So it was just 40 years ago that race happened, and 4 years before that, in 1974 in San Diego, was the first ever sort of triathlon, and that's where everything kind of grew from San Diego to Hawaii and then exploded around the world. It was pretty crazy going into the games. First of all, just getting into Sydney when they announced in '94 triathlon will be going into the Olympic Games, and the 2000 city will be Sydney Olympics or Sydney. So suddenly we knew we were going to Australia, and triathlon was going to be in there. So we had 6 years to try to get, countries competitive, and more than just the big 6 or 8 that were competitive at the time. I mean, if you look now, the Portugals and Italys and these countries that are, creating world-class triathletes, Argentina and Bermuda, They didn't exist in the triathlon. You know, there were about 7 or 8 countries if you look in the late 80s and early 90s. So Simon was lucky that he grew up in a province that was rich because of the triathlon series that Graham Fraser and then Mitch Fraser, his brother, eventually continued on. He had these opportunities that he could race at a competitive level in really hard races in his own backyard. And so that was an important element. He then had some senior guys older than him that had been traveling the world. And there's no question the Les McDonald factor you can never just, the size, the magnitude of what Les was able to do was massive. And so suddenly, why can't Canadians do well in triathlon? And so you also saw this fork in the road moment when triathlon got into the Olympics and it went from non-drafting to draft legal racing. And that was a critical moment. And it had a huge success rate on 2 levels because Peter Reid, Lisa Bentley, Laurie Bowden, all were amazing triathletes who had been racing Olympic distance. They were on our national Olympic distance team and they raced in places like New Zealand and all around the world representing us, Pan American Games, etc. But when it became draft legal, all of those athletes, Lisa and Laurie and Heather and Peter, all were average swimmers, spectacular bikers and spectacular biker runners. But they realized that the draft legal racing was probably not going to be their forte. And so immediately, while much of the rest of the world still were trying to get to the Olympic Games, and I can think of Australia and I can think of Great Britain, America, those 4 athletes in particular said, I am going directly to Ironman. I am going to learn how to be awesome. I'm going to learn how to win. And if you look at the number of wins that Lisa, Laurie, Heather, Peter got between, let's say, 94, 95 and about 2002, it's just off the charts. Laurie Bowden was on the podium for 7 straight years in Hawaii. 7 straight years. I mean, it's hard to fathom the consistency of being able to do that year after year after year. Breaking 3 hours, you know, in the marathon off the bike. These were things that these people were doing 20 years ago. And so Canada just had this wealth of athletes who were getting exposed in the local races in BC and Alberta, Ontario, Quebec. They had prize money at home, and then they started to win internationally, and that inspired the next generation of, you know, the Lionel Sanders of the world that we see today, and the Taylor Reids and the Cody Beals. All those people really have a great debt of, you know, gratitude to people like Peter Reid and Lisa Bentley and Laurie Bowden who came before them and learned how to win. Yeah, lots of people who watch the racing now may not realize that for 12 years of World Championships, roughly, we had non-drafting. So when Muskoka held the World Championships, if you look at old CBC footage from 1992, Joanne Ritchie and McKillie Jones and Simon Lessing getting out of the water, and they are having to keep their 10-meter gap between themselves and the other athletes. The problem that existed was as time went on, fields of 20 were now fields of 50. And fields of 2 or 3 good athletes were now fields of 30 good athletes. And people were coming out of the water within 10 seconds of each other, not 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, spread apart 1s and 2s. So suddenly you now had 25, 30 athletes coming out of the water in 35 seconds. They all biked about the same, and nobody wanted to give up an inch. And so this 10-meter gap that was, you know, supposed to be occurring just was not occurring. And I was at one race in English Bay where 12 of the first 16 men were disqualified for drafting. And I remember Les saying to me at the time, like, how can we go to the Olympic Games when like the 16th guy ends up winning because the first 14 were disqualified? And it was impossible. They were all so good that they couldn't get that gap away from each other. You're competitive. I'm not just going to sit up and let you get away. And so the challenge that happened in that era was there was a realization that the sport had gotten to the point with this Olympic distance, under 2-hour racing, there was just never going to be that big of a gap, ever, when you had that many good competitive athletes. And so sponsors were saying, look, I'd love to see you go by my grandstand 6 or 7 or 8 times. It's kind of boring for you like to take off and see in an hour. I'd also like to see my logo on television a lot more often. And so to professionalize the sport and give people the opportunity to make bigger prize purses, spectators to sit and have their beer in the VIP lounge and have some wine and see you go by every 5 or 6 minutes, the multi-lapped format came in. And when that multi-lap format came in, immediately that day, those who could swim got 2 check marks beside their name because they were already going to be, you know, rock stars. So Sharon Donnelly, as an example, who was a great swimmer for Canada, that gave her this leg up, and she made the 2000 Sydney Olympics, even though she didn't have many years of triathlon under her belt. And yet a Lori Bowden or a Lisa Bentley, who had many more years of racing, said, I can't swim fast enough that I'm going to make any of those packs. And then I might be running from 3 minutes down. So why don't I actually put it out there on an Ironman where all that hard work for me personally is rewarded in terms of me outrunning people head to head. So athletes looked at their skill set, and Canada and other countries started to identify athletes who were good swimmers, who would kind of probably move towards the Olympic distance, draft legal, and on the other side, the long distance. And so even though as we came in through this era, for at least another 5 or 6 years, even with the draft legal movement, there were really just Olympic distance. So 15 and 16-year-old juniors in 1998 were racing Olympic distance. And so there was an acknowledgement from the coaches, and we were in Edmonton in 2001 at the World Championships. And Jackie Gallagher, myself, and some other coaches put forward a recommendation that 2 things should happen. We should cut the distance down to 1/2 of that sprint for the juniors. These 16 and 17-year-olds should learn how to go fast and not just kind of hang on for 2 hours of racing. And that we needed a transition racing schedule between these 18-year-old juniors and these 24-year-old Alistair Brownlees. What do I do at a junior? How do I go race Simon Whitfield when I come out of being a big star as a junior? Suddenly I got to race 25-year-olds. So we created the under 23 division, which you didn't have to go into. If you were good enough to be your national champion and race with the best in the world, you could do that. And people like Alistair Brownlee never did go into the under 23 category. But for almost all countries, it's a huge important development phase. So if you really think of it, juniors are high school, under 23 are college, and then you make your living if you're good enough at it in the elite division after that. So what's happened on the world level is that in the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, these sprint races that you watch the top elite athletes in, and they're mixing back and forth between that and the Olympic distance, the standard distance. But 20 plus years ago, Australia were the world leaders in having these very short, fast races that are not unlike what you're seeing in Super League and Major League and these new events that are around the world. And so it's not ironic that Chris McCormack, the developer of Super League, was some of the athletes that was racing in Australia 20 plus years ago. And they were on beaches designed totally for that beer drinking Aussie who was out there, 50,000 of them, on a Saturday. And they would see these 75 incredible athletes who were doing very short swim, bike, run, back into the water, swim, bike, run. The Eliminator, that all existed 22, 23 years ago in Australia. And when you see how good the Aussies were in 87, 89, 91, 93, all of those athletes came out of that sprint culture of racing on the beaches in these competitive cutthroat racing that Australia had. And then foreigners started to go over to race in their series. They would spend the winter, the North American winter, in Australia, get into their series and do that format. And it was very sad when that series kind of left, and it was mostly because sponsor moved on and put their money elsewhere. Because I have seen a direct correlation to when that fell apart and Australia's absolute domination in the world. They still are one of the powers, but there was a moment when just mail them all the medals and whatever. And in fact, at the 99 World Championships, Australian women were 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. So you can imagine this is 1 year before the Olympics, and the Australian women at the World Champs in 99 take 1st to 5th. And there was questions like, well, should we even have an Olympics? Do we just mail them the medals and we'll just go and have our beers and not have to worry about putting the bike racks up? I mean, that's how good the Australians were. And they now are trying to make that comeback, but they lost that series, and I think it really has hurt them when you take a look. And they're realizing it. Chris McCormack's trying to create that series again. There's a couple things that happen. Some of them are systematic and some of them are cultural, I would say. So if you take a look, Australia, it really was cultural. Those athletes rode their bikes anyway. They swam with surfboards and did surf life-saving races, etc. So there's a lot of Aussies and Kiwis that have come from that kind of background. It was just part of what they did. They're called nippers when they were 7, 8, 10 years of age, like soccer players would be in Canada, or young hockey players. So they had those life-saving skills of swimming well in open water in big waves and so forth. And for them, all they needed were a few race directors to plunk some money down to do something they already were doing on Saturday anyway, and it just pulled the bodies in large numbers. Other places are a bit more systematic. So France, in Great Britain, and in Germany, those places have really developed clubs with coaches, with testing, we got enough of a VO2 max and enough power and so forth, and we direct this young man or woman into the sport a little bit more. And sometimes you get lucky and you have system and culture. And when you look at Great Britain with the Brownlees winning, I mean, we can go way, way back. For example, in the earliest days, Simon Lessing was a 5-time world champion, and intermixed with Simon Lessing from Great Britain was Spencer Smith. So they won basically 7 world championships over 10 years between just 2 British men. Then Tim Don comes along, and he kind of keeps things rocking and going. And then the icons of icons, Alistair and Johnny Brownlee, have kind of kept them going for the last 7 years. So British men have had role models, as well as the federation that put some money in with some great coaching and so forth. So they're more a byproduct of both, you know, the all-stars there on television that I can see as a role model, but they also have great coaching and systematic programs that get 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 16-year-old kids into the sport. Well, drafting is probably the most dirty word that's used when you think about the sport, because you either love it or hate it. If you enjoy what's happening in the ITU type racing, and those who don't think that those guys can ride a bike are just purely ignorant. And there have been people who've come in from the half Ironman racing and got absolutely schooled, including Chris McCormack, who was a phenomenal Ironman guy and had been an ITU world champion before it was in the drafting format for most of his career. When he was ITU, it was non-drafting. So what has happened is just the kind of training that you do to be able to go 600 watts for 30 seconds and then find a wheel and draft at 50, 60 k an hour down the side of a mountain is a different set of skills than to be aerodynamic for 3 to 5 hours on a bicycle. Each one of them are unique, incredible, should be respected for what they do, but they're different. In ITU now, we're seeing, and I just saw it again in Montreal on the weekend, strategic planning starts happening. So the 2 young Norwegian kids in Montreal on the weekend, they waited till they finally all got together on lap 4, going up a hill. It's going to be technical. They break away and get a small 3 or 4 man breakaway and change the outcome of the race. Whereas in Ironman, it is supposed to be, and I use the word supposed to be, non-drafting. But if you've ever been at a large 70.3 race or an Ironman race, they're having the exact same challenges that the ITU had 20 years ago, which is now 20 guys come out of the water within 30 seconds of each other, and they've got 90K to ride, and they all can ride 320 watts or 330 watts or whatever. They have the same kind of quality equipment. Getting those gaps to be maintained and enforced are very difficult. And so I know that Uber riders like Sebastian Kienle and Lionel Sanders and Cameron Wurf and others, they are looking for races that are either very hilly and make people not have the chance to be able to sit in a pack in a half Ironman race, or they're just going and trying to destroy the pack and just implode it, and if anybody tries to come with them, they'll start to pay the price later on. So, but it is a frustration. I know that Lionel had a major issue when he went to the World Championships in Australia. He had his greatest bike run combination of his entire life ever in terms of the total wattages and what he ran, and he still was in 6th or 7th place. And when you looked at the wattages of some of the others, it was clear that they could not have ridden that fast without being in a draft pack for significant portions of, etc. So it is a challenge, it is a problem, and it's a problem even bigger, honestly, in age group racing. Texas, we're having packs of 100 people. And so if officials aren't really monitoring it, it can get quite out of hand. And so they're trying to do things like having bigger gaps between waves starting, women on one day and men on the other day in some races in that kind of format. So they are making attempts, but when you put competitive people together in small geography, it's going to be a bit of a problem. And so now, what I hear in ITU racing now, not that guy was sitting on my wheel, as we heard 25 years ago in fights in anger. Now you hear a guy lamenting that, oh my God, I just missed the pack by 3 seconds out of the transition zone. So it's his own problem or her own problem, not the fact that I was sitting on some guy's wheel for the entire 40K and then outran him by 3 seconds. The other thing that has grown and will explode, most people have not had any exposure or very little to mixed team triathlon. And triathlon, again, was leading cutting edge when you look at what the senior administrators did. we wanted to get more medals at the Olympic Games. And the IOC said, look, we just don't have more room for another 50 or 100 athletes to come into the village. So what can you do with the same athletes you already have? Swimming has relays, and then 100 and the 200, and go down the list. Triathlon, to get more medals, needed a relay, but no country has 4 women or 4 men. The max you can have of any country is 3 at the Olympic Games, and most have 2 or 1. So to be able to make a relay team of 4, the only logical way was put your 2 men with your 2 women, and now you have a relay team. And so triathlon did it out of necessity, not necessarily even, I don't think they were being that cagey at the time. It was like, how do we get 4 people? Well, most countries have 4 at the World Championships. What if we put the 2 men and 2 women in a mixed race? And so essentially they're doing 1/4 of an Olympic race. And so it's women to men. And for those who haven't seen that kind of racing, they will do a 300-meter swim. The women will take off, all the women from all of the countries. First woman takes off, 300-meter swim, draft legal onto the bike for something 9 to 10K in distance, usually 2 laps in front of the crowd, very quick, very fast, very dynamic, coming off to a 1-mile run, tag the guy. He does the exact same swim bike run, tags the girl to the swim bike run, tags the anchor man. So now you've got 15, 16 transitions happening, all in just over 75 minutes. Did you use up your best legs first? Did you save your best legs for last? Do you have some secret weapon, Nicholas Spirik, who can bike away from everybody in the middle of the race and give your final guy 20-second lead starting on the run? Every country has to figure out how to use their athletes. But now there are many other sports in the last 6 years that now have mixed team in swimming and track, even in curling and other sports. I've now seen it at the Olympics, but it all grew out of triathlon's necessity. If we want to have another medal, and we are in Tokyo with a full additional medal, so there will be women's triathlon on day 2 and men's triathlon on day 4, and 6 days later it'll be mixed team triathlon, etc. And so you're even now seeing a bit more of a transition to even shorter, faster, more dynamic racers, because in some cases countries are saying, I think we have a legitimate chance to win a medal in the team race, but I don't think our guys are really that good to go for 2 hours. So we may actually pick athletes who are best suited for the team race, and they also do the individual race, versus we're picking our best Olympic distance athletes who might not be very skilled at being able to go hard for 20 minutes. So it's a different kind of athlete, and it's benefiting in many ways the younger athlete, because to go for 20 minutes full on is something that an 18 to 22-year-old can do. To go full on for 2 hours, you're probably 26 to 28. So it's a different aged athlete that's seemingly, I think, going to start being a factor.
It's extremely exciting and tactical.
Yeah,
that style.
And federations are making these decisions as we speak. They've now had 5 or 6 world mixed team championships. We're in the middle of countries right now trying to qualify. So we're halfway through the 2-year window. By May of 2020 will be the, that's it. That's the number of points now. Did you qualify a team? How many athletes did you qualify? And it's up to each federation. Essentially, you first have to qualify under ITU's, am I eligible? How many people do we have eligible? And then it's up to your federation to make the decision. We have 6 American women. We can only take 3. Do we go by alphabetical order? Do we have a one-day race? Do we go on the world ranking points? It's totally up to the federation to make up the decision. It could be discretionary. It could be whatever. And so it's painful when you watch a great athlete who doesn't go because maybe they're the 4th Aussie or the 4th American, and they might be ranked 10th in the world, but they just happen to come from the United States of America, and there's 7 great American women in the top 25, and 4 of them aren't going to go.
I have to hear you talk about Lionel Sanders a bit, because he's a huge name in the sport right now. He's putting out great stuff on social media with Talbot Cox and stuff. Tell us a little bit about Lionel Sanders.
Well, I'm happy, I'm lucky to have met Lionel when he was still 15, 16 years of age. So he and I grew up in the very same small town of 2,000 people, no stoplight, no Tim Hortons, at least at that era when we were growing up, on Lake Erie, called Harrow. Harrow, near Windsor, on Lake Erie, 2,000 people. And better known for tomatoes and Heinz, and now it's called French. Heinz has left Leamington, and it's now French's ketchup. That's in Essex County. But Lionel and I grew up in the same town, same high school of 450 people, and I was a generation ahead of him. But some of his teachers were my teachers, and at the end of their career, they were his teachers, beginning of my career. And I got a phone call one day from Dale Larson, his cross-country coach, saying, look, I've got this kid who's just way different than everybody else on our team. Can you help me coach this kid? So over that whole winter, and I'd sent some workouts and then into the cross-country and track season, and only met him at OFSA in Kingston that year. And I remember thinking, wow, this kid doesn't look like I thought he would look. I was thinking I was going to see this ectomorphic runner type kid based on all the fast times he was running in cross country, but I saw what looked like a soccer player, rugby player, strong looking young man. And so we went for supper. I gave him a bit of advice, which he immediately did not use any of, and that was to like go out in 10th or 12th and try to work his way through the field. And 400 meters into the race, he was leading 300 high school kids at OFSA and finished 20th. So his personality of going from the gun, was shown right away. And so after a couple of years of high school, I lost track of him. I was trying to find out where he'd gone. Nobody really knew. And so he just kind of disappeared. Even though I was still curious, nobody really knew. I thought maybe did he go to Michigan State? Is he running? Where is he? And then one day I pick up a magazine. I see Lionel Sanders, 20 years of age, Ironman Louisville, 10 hours and some minutes. And I'm like, wow, the kid did an Ironman. I was trying to encourage him to use a bicycle 4 years ago, and clearly he's done something. So I tracked him down on social media, found him on Facebook. And he started to tell me his unfortunate story of, after high school, he got mixed up with some tough guys who were involved with drugs, and he became incredibly addicted and, basically stopped going to school, stopped running, and over a period of about a year and a half, literally almost never left this little basement. He was hearing voices, he was not exercising, he was antisocial. And at the very lowest moment of his life, he was sitting in a garage with a chain around his neck. And that was it. That was going to be it. And he started to think about how his family would feel realizing that their son had committed suicide, and in his mind they had done nothing wrong. He had made the wrong decisions. He had been the one that got addicted. They had tried to help him. They had lent him money. They had tried many things. So he came off the step ladder, had the courage to come down, and eventually called his father and connected with his parents and convinced his mom he wanted to do an Ironman. And he had at that point probably not used all the resources they had given him as wisely as one should. So I don't think his mom trusted him. So I think if the story is correct, she sent in the entry fee for him. She wouldn't give him the cash. She paid for it. And so he started doing little tiny $30, $40 jobs, got himself a little bike, went to a local pool, couldn't swim, and got through Ironman Louisville, and still tells the story. The guy that won that particular race was going to the finishing line, and he was lapping Lionel on the run. Oh my God, how could a guy break 9 hours for an Ironman? So anyway, I see the results. I call him. We have this conversation, and I encourage him to come up to Caledon, 5 miles from where we're standing right now. And I brought him to a weekend training camp with our club, with C3. And I really wanted, once he told me the stories about his kind of drug use, I just wanted to see, is this kid clean? Is he look, healthy? What's going on? So he came for the weekend, and I had him stay with our captain of our team, Sean Bechtel. And I just wanted to get Sean's kind of thumbs up, thumbs down. Is this kid real? Is he a problem? What do you think? And by the end of the weekend, Sean said, I think he's a good kid. So kudos to Sean. He's a classy guy. And a few weeks later, I invite Lionel to come to Tucson, Arizona to our training camp. So he comes down to this training camp. He really basically knows nobody other than the 2 days he met them in Caledon. And he's still kind of antisocial. He trains and then goes off to his bedroom, trains, goes off to his bedroom. And by the end of the 10 days in Arizona, I realized how special this kid was. I mean, he was doing times up Mount Lemmon that no one I'd ever met before could do, and this was on borrowed bicycle. So it was clear that he was a special power, special unit, mentally tough. And I was still concerned about kind of the drug culture that was, maybe in the community that he was living. So I said, look, I will get involved with you, but you have to move up to where I live. I need you to be in Hamilton where all my athletes are going to school. And we got him into McMaster University. He ran for Paula Schnurr, who did a phenomenal job with a men's cross-country team at that time. Andrew York, Taylor Reed, John Rasmussen, all on this team. Literally at one point they had 7 triathletes who came second in the championships with 7 triathletes. So it showed that this cross-training was working. And a former Olympic swim coach named Andrew Cole agreed to spend some time with Lionel. which never really materialized. Lionel, being stubborn, decided that he would just go into the pool an hour after swim practice and do his own thing. So he never improved in the water for a period of time. But I sent him to World Duathlon Championships. He started to get that kind of movement. He stayed in Hamilton. I brought him to Caledon for a couple of summers where he helped run our kids' summer camp. And in fact, Kira Gupta Baltar, as it turns out, was in that summer camp and was inspired by Lionel 8 years ago, and now she's going to the World Championships in Australia as a junior. So Lionel's impact continues to be massive. But he stayed at Andrew York's house, trained over the summer. We started to get him some good equipment. And then there were about 4 milestone moments in my memory of him. And one was just coming up to Caledon and meeting our team. The second was coming down to Tucson and showing me how amazing he was. The third was moving away from your family and friends and culture in Harrow and Windsor and coming up to Hamilton. And then the next massive one was Muskoka 70.3. And he forever is lucky because all of the great athletes were in Vegas for the 70.3 Worlds. But Raylert had been injured and had not accumulated enough points to get to 70.3 Worlds. So he shows up in Muskoka.
Michael Raylert?
Andre. I think it's Andre. Memory starts to get foggy at my age, but I'm pretty sure it was Andreas Raylert.
It was too, yeah.
And this was going to be an easy victory for Andreas Raylert. Craig Alexander had won this race 3, 4, 5 times. Said, look, it's a great race before the World Champs in Hawaii. Go there, you get easy prize money, lovely people, you'll love it. And so Lionel beats this guy by probably 4 minutes. I remember being on the mountain bike on the run, and Raylert's eyes were like blown away. He's running these incredible kilometers at kilometer 14, 15, and he's losing time to Lionel. And so that win, coupled with Andreas Raylert just being a very classy guy and saying, my God, how good is this kid? I mean, I came here thinking I'm in good shape. I'm going to win this thing easy. And this absolutely complete stranger wins this race. That is pretty special. And so that was a milestone moment because the next day in papers and magazines and blogs, instead of who knows, nobody named kid from Canada won a race that nobody was at because everybody was in Vegas racing the 70.3, it's superstar Andreas Raylert got beat by somebody who's got to have something special. And that really was the turning point. I was able to use that to help Lionel with, sponsors like Skechers and Freshie, and Garneau was the first. In fact, Garneau, it's 9 o'clock at night when they signed the contract to sponsor Lionel, and the next morning was the 70.3 Worlds in Mount Tremblant. We were in Mount Tremblant having these negotiations. And the next day, in the most competitive 70.3 ever on, at that time, the hardest race, first time they were ever outside the United States for 70.3 Worlds, Javier Gomez, Jan Frodeno, Tim Don, and fourth place not far back across the line, beating some spectacularly talented athletes, was Lionel Sanders, who was dead last out of the water. Like, he was so dead last, there wasn't even the vapor smell of a bicycle when he got there. So, these little milestones kind of keep going. And then if you follow Lionel's career, he's a self-made guy. I mean, there's 1,000 people who've contributed, different coaches, different people. But essentially, he and Erin have been spectacular. That's his wife. She actually moved from Windsor up to Hamilton when we were at McMaster. And together, the two of them have really kind of gone through the pathway. I've been there on and off over times, back again helping him now as we head towards Hawaii in another few weeks. And as just all of the requests of media and sponsors and, that kind of stuff, et cetera. But he makes mistakes regularly, acknowledges them publicly, learns from them, makes maybe a slightly different version of that mistake another time, but he's continued to get stronger, better, smarter. And this could be the most exciting, I think, ever Hawaii Ironman. I think you're going to see 4 to 6 men under 8:10. I think in the conditions are right, you could see the first sub 8 hours ever, maybe a couple guys under 8 in Hawaii. I think you'll see the closest top 5 in terms of, the gap of time. When Mark and Dave were 1-2 in 89, I think it was 15 minutes to the third place guy. You could have 4 to 5 minutes, I think, between the podium. And so Jan Frodeno, unbelievably talented guy, would love to go out, I think, on top. Obviously, he's Olympic champion, 2-time Hawaii. He's not going there to, get a T-shirt. Javier Gomez making his debut. Everyone knows what Javier can do, and we've seen his magic, and he's beaten every person in the world multiple times. So, you know, we know that it's been maybe 20 some years since Luc Van Lierde was the first guy that won the race on his first attempt. So Javier's got history against him, but he's as good as anybody has ever been in the sport. So he's going to be spectacular, no question about it. Patrick Lang is going to be right in there, Sebastian Kienle, and you could easily throw 2 or 3, you know, other athletes into there. The Brits have a couple of guys, you know, others. Yeah, so Hawaii, I mean, the women's side could be a little boring this year. You know, it's going to be hard pressed to see anybody doing much damage to Daniela Ryf if she wants to go and strut her stuff and execute to her perfect day. But on the men's side, I think you're going to have some implosions as guys trying to go for the win. I think you might have a surprise 1 or 2, as we saw last year with our bronze medalists coming in. But I have no doubt that the Uber bikers like Starkowitz and Lionel and Sebastian and Werf and a couple of others, they're not going to want to let that 20-person pack just be kind of wandering through the first 50 miles. And so some of it for Lionel will be where his swim is. He's still not where he needs to be. He's improving. He knows he's a project. If he can narrow what was at some point 7, 8, 9 minutes down to 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, that would be spectacular. But the nice part about him is that he's not giving up thinking that I could be coming out of the water with these guys. And it might take him 3 more years to do that. But he's still one of the youngest guys in the elite field. And, Cameron Bown is maybe 43 years of age, and he's been a multiple bronze medalist there, and I think 10 or 11 Ironman New Zealands. And so the age of these guys, can still be winning these things at late 30s. And so in Lionel's case, he certainly isn't running out of time, but he knows at this point there's a big difference between being a second place man in Hawaii Ironman and a Hawaii Ironman champion. Just as Simon knows, there's a big difference between being an Olympic gold medalist and Olympic silver medalist.
Lionel's been open about his recent dietary change in that it's been significant and he's eating a lot more fruits and vegetables. Some people have speculated that he's gone vegan. He hasn't said that. What are your thoughts on that?
Recent race experience.
Sure. Well, I'm going to actually hold off on making comments on that because I've got some inside information, I'd be I'd be showing a few cards that I don't want to show until after Hawaii's done. All that I will say is that to Lionel's credit, he leaves no stone unturned, and so his Colonel Sanders days of they're calling the Colonel and his 4 big whoppers at the finishing line or the night before. He's realizing that his body is something that he has to respect, and he's added things like strength training and certainly regular massage and ART and other stuff like that into his regime. When you know that Javier Gomez and Sebastian Kienle and Jan Frodeno are making more good decisions than bad decisions, you have to kind of narrow off the things that you can control. And he obviously can't control the fact that those guys swim incredibly well. They can't control the fact that he can hold 400 watts for an hour, that kind of thing. So everybody has to kind of optimize their cards, and I think Lionel's a smart guy, and he's been off to the Gatorade research lab in Chicago recently, and he's learned more about his body there, and he's a science numbers guy. And so once he understands numbers, he is religious to it. And I have no doubt that he'll just keep narrowing down until he makes the best decisions for his body at this time in his career. This next 6 weeks are going to be pretty exciting. So my first road trip is to the Gold Coast for the World Championships. And I think, this might be year 26 or 7 or whatever I've made of consistent World Championships, haven't missed. So that's exciting, but I'm as excited to watch the juniors as the under-23s, as the elites and the age group in Paris. So for me, it'll be a very busy 4 or 5 days of being a big kind of fan of the sport. From there, I come immediately back, and the next morning I leave with a 70-year-old named Bob Nucky to go to Tucson for his final warm weather training camp. And the objective there is this guy has gone 11 hours and 25 minutes as a 70-year-old, albeit at an easier course than Hawaii. He's trying to become the first man to break 12 hours in Hawaii as a 70-year-old. and to try to win the World Championships. And there's about 7 or 8 really outstanding guys in that category that all could be on the podium. And so at no point are we taking anything for granted. And so I have 2 dreams in Hawaii. One is to see Lionel Sanders break 8 hours and win the race. And the second is for Lionel to be back 4 hours later to put a wreath around Bob Nucky's head as he comes in at 11:54 and wins the men's 70 category. So, you know, at my age, I still dream, which is great. Gets me out of bed every morning and hungry. So that's kind of the fall. And then the next project is getting the next generation. We have a young group of 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are the most talented group of athletes I've ever worked with in 35 years. So including the Simon Whitfield era. Obviously Simon was unique, but I'm talking now a group of 5, 6, 7 athletes. So C3 is a nonprofit club in the just outside of Toronto and Caledon area where we live. And a unique bunch of people who really work hard to raise funds, to put the money back into young athletes. So companies like Vanilla Prepaid and Benson Steel and Royal Containers all have been huge supporters of what we do. And unfortunately, money is a factor. You know, if I can get a massage, I keep away from an injury. If I can improve my quality of my bike wheels, maybe that makes a bit of time, or if I can get another swim lesson. So we invest the money as much as we can into young athletes, and already paying dividends. We've got a 16-year-old who will be racing at the World Championships, and literally 12 months ago, she did her first triathlon. So she's going to the World Championships in 12 months. Now, what did we do to help her? 12 months ago, I talked to her uncle and said, look, wouldn't it be amazing? I know it's extravagant, but you've got a fair number of frequent flyer miles. If your niece could come and watch the World Championships. She's only done 2 triathlons, but just watch. So she came to Rotterdam, sat like a sponge for 3 days, learned everything she could, came back and did every workout we could have asked her to put in 12 months. And here she is 12 months later racing those same girls she saw a year before. So having watched...
So we know her name, the Canadian up-and-comer to watch.
Yeah, Kira Gupta-Baltzar. She's 16, and we were just in Montreal on the weekend where she came out on the feet of Emma Jackson out of the water in 20 seconds up on a pro pack of women who were 25 years old. So I've been lucky enough to see incredible talent, and that's the Simons and the Lori Bowdens and athletes of that nature who've come through Carol Montgomery 20 plus years ago. And I also have seen the hard-working athletes like Andrew York. He was modestly talented, but his heart and desire was off the charts, and he went to the Olympic Games. So to watch what is possible when you put a coach and a club and a goal and some hard work, it's really special. And so, you know, if I can come away from Hawaii with Lionel and Bob Nucky as world champions, that may be the greatest 24 hours of my triathlon life. One at the highest level of elite and one at the highest level of 70-year-old men's racing. And I'll be peeing my pants for both races, you know, nervous, excited, etc. So, you know, I'm as excited by watching the age group racing as I am of the elite racing.
It's one of the beautiful things about triathlon.
Yeah, for sure. And when you realize the journeys that people have had and the obstacles they've had to overcome and all of those kinds of things, you realize that it's not easy to do. It's something that does take a lot of time, and you got to sometimes get lucky. You know, that flat tire the guy beside you got, you didn't get, or that you know, that bad piece of meat the night before, he got it out of the the food bin before you did and got sick. So I've seen enough races where people have got ill, had flat tires, unfortunate circumstances, that it's not just all of the preparation. I still, in my heart, believe there's a little bit of luck that has to come along. Lionel's following is around the world, and one of the things that we're going to do, I'm formalizing it in the next 4 or 5 days, we're actually going to have Lionel Sanders viewing parties around the world. And so they'll need to get in touch with me directly. So Barrie, B-A-R-R-I-E, at personalbest.ca. And we're going to formalize a strategy of where, you know, 10 or more people, and it could be at a fitness center, at a bike shop, at a restaurant, whatever, a house party. And there'll be draw prizes, some great draw prizes that your house party are eligible for. And you simply just got to be saying, look, we're having a Lionel Sanders, sending that man some power, some energy. We're going to be cheering that guy on. If you're in North America, it's a pretty good time zone because the race basically starts, you know, just around noon here. And done by 8 o'clock at night kind of thing. So depending if you're in New Zealand, Australia, you might be having your viewing party at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm not so sure of your time zones, but we're going to have them all around the world. And Lionel has fans in Brazil, Costa Rica, you name it, Pucan, Chile. And so he's got an ever-growing group of fans, and we want to be able to kind of have a relationship with them. We're going to send off some personal video from Lionel just to those viewing parties so that they're having a special experience, and it could be, I'm hoping there'll be a big one in Windsor where he's from, but wherever they are, we just want to have some people who are going to get together, watch the live streaming of the show, and send some positive energy for hopefully about 7 hours and 57 minutes.
So people who are interested in doing that, how are you organizing that?
I'm going to have them actually contact me by email. So Barrie at personalbest.ca, Barrie at personalbest.ca, and we're going to have more stuff up in social media after the Labor Day weekend. But basically, they just need to know that they're hosting a party, and we'll put it on the website. People who want to join in can contact and say, hey, we're going to go to that restaurant and have a beer and watch the last 2 hours of the race, or watch the whole race, depending on how psychotic you are.
Awesome. And anything else you want to share?
No, just blessed. For somebody who has no talent, to have been able to spend the last 35 years of my life announcing the races, coaching at the races, standing at finishing lines, seeing the magic of families, hugging their son or daughter at Olympics, at an Ironman, their dad at an Ironman. It's been a very special journey and very lucky. Again, it's about timing. If I had come 15 years later, 90% of those opportunities would have been taken up by somebody who was more talented at commentating, at coaching, at whatever. So I just happen to be lucky to come along at the right time.
Lucky, but you've done a lot of great work, and
well, lots of people that I really truly need to thank. Starting most importantly with my wife, who has lived this life. We're now 25 plus years of marriage, and she knows at certain times of the year, not going to have suppers, together for much, and yet she's, she knows every one of those athletes. She's been cheering for them, and she's driven them to airports and stood at finishing lines when they've been in tears with crash bikes and so forth. So it's a part of our life at this point, and I'm blessed that I have a wife who's supportive of it. She's the athlete. She's done 10 Ironman. I've only got a couple under my belt, but she's done 10 of them in multiple world championships as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Barrie.
Awesome. Thanks.